and welcome to Always Take Notes.
A message from our sponsor, Scrivener. Is your word processor holding you back? Are you constantly breaking your flow to search your computer for vital notes or research? If so, Scrivener can help.
Scrivener is a best-selling app tailor-made for writers, combining all the tools you'll need to craft your first draft. However you write, Scrivener molds to fit your style. Plan everything first or just get writing, and restructure later using the app's integrated outlining tools. Got a good idea but don't know where it fits? Write when inspiration strikes, then find its place later.
Rearrange your plot on virtual index cards in Scrivener's corkboard, or work with an overview of a chapter, a part, or even your whole manuscript using Scrivener's outliner. Break chapters into shorter, more manageable sections, and then edit them in isolation or as a whole.
In Scrivener, you'll find everything you need to get writing and keep writing. Find out why it's the favourite app of best-selling writers and aspiring authors alike by taking the 30-day free trial, or use the code TAKENOTES before 20th of June for a 20% discount on Scrivener for macOS or Windows at www.scrivener.com. Hello and welcome to Always Take Notes. In this episode, Rachel and myself spoke with the novelist and non-fiction writer Dani Shapiro.
We spoke to Dani about her celebrated early memoir, Slow Motion, about moving between fiction and writing about her own life, and about inheritance, an investigation into her parentage.
It's a great episode, and we hope you enjoy it.
Welcome, Dani, to Always Take Notes. It's fantastic to have you on the show. I wondered if we could start with the subject of secrets. It's something that you say has been a defining interest of your life and work. I wonder if you could remember or put your finger on a time that you kind of first became interested in them as a child.
It's a great question. I think I grew up in a house where secrets were just in the air around me. And there was really this air of secrecy. It was a large house in, a suburb of New York City, and there were intercoms in the rooms. And there was like a little device on the telephones. This is obviously pre-cell phones. And there was this little device where you could lift this little doohickey up and no one else could listen in on your conversation. I mean, why? There was just, my parents would stop speaking sometimes when I walked into the room. They would start speaking to each other in, another language so I wouldn't understand. So there was a sense that I had that I could not have articulated as a child, but that there was a lot that I didn't know. So I think that was formative for me.
And could you tell us a little bit more about, your origins of interest in writing and literature? We saw that you said growing up the only child of elder parents was a kind of key factor that made you a writer. So your father was an Orthodox Jew, your mother was Jewish, but not religious. Tell us, particularly being an only child, the role that had for you.
Well, I think being an only child, I was left to my own devices a lot. And I lived in the world of my imagination. Also, because my father was, as you said, an observant Jew, we were, as a family, we observed the Sabbath. What that meant was I couldn't go anywhere. I couldn't do anything. I couldn't watch television or listen to the radio or even ride my bike. So there was just a lot of time for kind of daydreaming and an imaginative life. I certainly didn't know or imagine that the possibility of a literary career or becoming a writer was something that was available to me or to anyone. I didn't connect the fact that there were all these books on the shelves with the idea that people had spent their lives writing them.
Can you remember what some of the things you wrote about were in your childhood years?
Oh yeah, I mean, I was a prolific liar. I wrote letters to. I tended to make friends who were older than I was, sometimes as much as 10 years older than I was, and I would write them letters in which I would just make up these sort of outlandish stories about what was happening in my life, none of which was true. And I really secretly harbored the fear that there was something very wrong with me. Of course, pathological liars don't actually ever entertain the thought that they are pathological liars. But I didn't know that then. I just thought I'm making all these stories up. Why am I doing this?
And could you tell us about Judy Blume and what she meant for you? We saw that you said that Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret was the book that pierced my sense of otherness and made me realise I wasn't alone or unique in the way I felt about myself in the world. Judy Blume is obviously a writer that's been hugely significant for many, many readers and writers, but tell us about your experience with her.
Yeah, and I would preface it also by saying I had no idea that Judy Blume had grown up in the same little corner of the States as I had, really pretty much in the same town at different times. She was a good deal older than I was, but we sort of breathed the same air and inhabited the same soil, which is not something I knew. I think with that book, the feeling was there was a lot that I didn't understand about my feelings, or I felt like I must be the only person in the world to feel this way. And Judy Blume had a way of capturing and illuminating the psyche, the interior life of a young girl, that made me feel less alone and made me feel like um, maybe the thoughts and the feelings and the sense of alienation or the sense of being in a body that was growing up it wasn't only me. There was this character, Margaret, who was also going through those same things. So that's really where it started. When I eventually met Judy Blume and she and I had become friends, I felt like I was like meeting, the world's, well, I was meeting like a really big rock star.
I'm sure she must get that a lot. And you went to Sarah Lawrence, and you were taught by Grace Paley. I mean, what was that experience like? And did it kind of sharpen your desire to be a writer?
When I went to Sarah Lawrence, that was the first time I ever met actual writers. Sarah Lawrence is about a half an hour north of New York City, so a lot of the faculty were writers who were supporting themselves in part by teaching. And there was just this whole group of writers who were modeling that as a life, as a possibility. And Grace was just this extraordinary presence there. To be her student was she was a mother, she was a grandmother, she had a family. She wrote these magnificent short stories. She was a social activist. Cannot imagine what she would make of our country now. And we would sometimes go to class and there would be a note on the door saying, "Class is canceled, Grace is in jail," because she was, doing some act of civil disobedience. And so she modeled this intensely passionate connection to the world and like a real sort of moral imperative as a writer. And then she just wrote these sentences that were, all her own and stunning. I spent a lot of time learning from her and with her, but still, even in those years, at 17, 18, 19, I thought, wow, it really is possible to have a life like this. I didn't feel like it was possible for me to have a life like this. I just saw that it was something that some people could do.
Could you also tell us about the experiences that eventually made their way into Slow Motion, the memoir? So dropping out of college, becoming the mistress of a friend's stepfather, and then estrangement from your parents. Tell us about that period of your life.
So when I went to Sarah Lawrence, I was a very young 17 and had been in certain ways very sheltered and was, naive and I would say kind of lost. I was there for a couple of years. I was not ready to be, to sort of take advantage of everything that school had to offer. Joseph Campbell was teaching there. I never even knew that Joseph Campbell was there. And I dropped out after a couple of years. I had essentially what I would say now been preyed upon by the stepfather of a friend and classmate of mine. And he was all the things that you are, if you look in a dictionary, for like really bad boyfriend material. He was married. He was the stepfather of my friend. He was a sociopath. He was extremely powerful and charismatic. And he also was kind of a predator, and I was kind of a target. And I took up with him. Had I left school at that point? I actually can't remember whether I left school. No, I hadn't left school yet. And I would also say, and this is something I find I can really only say now at this point in my life, I had such confusion about my identity. I was raised Orthodox. I did not look quote unquote Jewish. I was fielding comments all my life about what I looked like and how I couldn't possibly be who I believed myself to be. So there was this kind of core, almost like a trap door in my identity that I didn't understand. And I left school. I started acting and modeling because those doors were open to me, and that's kind of all I thought I was good for. And I was a terrible actress, just absolutely dreadful. But I was working a bit, and I was involved in this relationship. And in 1986, when I was 23, my parents were in a terrible car crash, and my father died as a result of his injuries. And my mother was very badly injured and wasn't expected to survive. And, as I said before, I was an only child. So it was this massive, it was really a wake-up call. It was a tragedy in my family's life. I was in a state of profound grief. I was untethered, and I was responsible for my mother. And during that time also, my family really fell apart. There was bad blood between my mother and my father's family. I got caught in the middle of that. And so I really was very much alone. I'm not sure I would have understood that at the time as much as I look back now as the mother of a son who's around that age and think, my God, you were so young, and so alone. But that's what it was. It was also, in this kind of like deeply paradoxical way, it was the worst thing that had ever happened to me, and also probably what saved my life, because it shocked me out of this torpor that I had been in. And in that year after my father's death, I went back to Sarah Lawrence. They let me back in. Not sure that would happen today, but back then just called the dean and she said, come on back. And I had, I think, 1 year and maybe a few more credits to go. And that was the year that I started coming into my own sense of being as a writer.
And how did you make your first steps into the writing world once you'd kind of had that realization? Your first book was published in 1990 when you were in your late 20s, but had you had experiments in writing and trying to get published before that point?
I had never tried to get published. I certainly had been writing. I remember Grace Paley saying to me at some point during that senior year, you should go to graduate school. There's the door to the graduate program. Just walk through that door, and, like in this period of time of a lot of loss and pain and grief and things that were hard, there was also a lot of grace, maybe pun intended. And I enrolled in the Master's of Fine Arts program at Sarah Lawrence. And in the beginning of the MFA program there, I was writing short stories because that's all anyone ever did in the fiction program is you were not going to write anything longer than a short story because in a way it was sort of hedging your bets that by the end of this commitment and this program that you might have a few good stories. But if you began a novel and the novel didn't work, then what? So no one was writing novels. One of my professors, I was writing the same short story over and over and over again about, a young woman whose parents die in a car accident and who has an affair with, it's an incredibly autobiographical story that I kept on writing in every which way. I think I wrote it in the first person, the second person, the third person, in a kind of a mosaic, in a chronological way, an experimental way. And finally, one of my professors, I think in a state of absolute frustration and impatience with me, wrote in the margin, "I think it's time to move on to the novel." And that was terrifying, and also brought with it a feeling of rightness. Like, yes, whatever that means, I don't know how to do this, but on to the novel. And that was my first novel that I wrote while at Sarah Lawrence, and it was my MFA thesis.
The subject of formal creative writing education is something that comes up a lot on the show. What's your view, of the merits and maybe some of the complexities of the kind of MFA route?
Yeah, I can talk about that both as a student and as someone who taught in these programs for many years. I'm glad I got an MFA, but not because of the degree per se, but because it was a couple of years of like time out of time to completely focus on literature, to completely focus on process, to to have the privilege of being able to do that. And I was exposed to writers I had never been exposed to before. I had some great professors who became friends and mentors. But back then, when I sold my first book while I was in the MFA program, which was very unusual. And I sort of found my way then into the world of literary publishing. That was my beginnings. Was I had a book contract, and that's how I started. But the degree itself was not in any way a professional degree. It was a like wildly creative experience for those couple of years, and that served me really, really well. And I was lucky because. I mean, it wasn't only luck, but there was luck involved in the timing that, in a way, my education into publishing came from actually publishing. In more recent decades, the degree has become much more professionalized, and I see a lot of. It's one of the reasons why I don't teach in academia anymore. I see a lot of students come in with so much pressure on them. They're getting a degree. I remember for years I was teaching at an MFA program in New York City, and I would begin my class by saying to the assembled group in my workshop, "You're getting a degree that entitles you to nothing." Because I just wanted to get it out of the way. Because I would think back and think, I've probably taught hundreds and hundreds of MFA students over the years, and maybe at the most 5% of them go on and have, careers as writers writing books. And at the same time, the programs, I won't mention the university, but I was teaching at a very prestigious university that doubled the size of its MFA program while I was there. Why? It wasn't because there were twice as many really deserving writers who were all paying full freight. These were not, so one of the things I say to a young writer who's thinking about doing this is apply to programs where you're fully funded, so that when you graduate, you're not graduating with debt, because you're going into a very uncertain, business, if we can call it a business, where we're not, there's no playbook for it. There's no do these things and these things will work out. And also financial anxiety, I think, is one of the worst kinds of anxieties that a creative person can experience. And so going in, beginning a life as a writer saddled with debt doesn't seem to me to be the best way in.
I think that's certainly true. Among that 5% of successful, or writers that went on to have successful writing careers from the programs, can you detect any traits or similarities or things that they shared, or do you think it does just come down to luck and timing for the most part?
I think that there is luck, there is timing, there is talent, but there is also this other trait that I would say all of the writers that are running through my mind right now, who I've taught, share, which is a word that came up in this essay that the great editor and critic Ted Solitaroff once wrote this essay about the essay was called Writing in the Cold, the First 10 Years. And in it, he muses about the promising writers that he knew who are sort of kind of disappeared 10 years on, and then writers who he hadn't necessarily thought would go the distance who are. And the word is endurability, the ability to endure. Another way that I've heard it described is, and this is very much true for my career, is, you fill a bathtub with water, one drop of water at a time. Eventually, you will be able to take a bath. Eventually, there will be a tub full of water. But it really is this kind of ethic of doing the work regardless, doing the work whether or not it's being accepted, received, not being, what's the word I want? Not being sort of flattened by comparison. Back in some of these graduate writing programs that I taught in, I had just rooms full of students with burning ambition. And when I think of them now, one of them, the two of them who are very successful writers today, it took them a long time to find their footing. There was one writer, and I've written about this. I actually wrote about her book in Tin House, who sold a book while she was in one of these graduate writing programs, was burning with ambition and also talent, and she wasn't ready. She got over her skis, and in the end, that seemed at the time like, to everyone around my workshop table, I had students in my office crying because they thought, well, only one of us is going to have this kind of opportunity, and it's her, so therefore it won't be me. And that's not how it works. It might be how it works if you're talking about Juilliard and concert violinists, and there's probably one in a generation, but that's not how it works with writers. I think the writers who hewed to their own vision, stayed true to it, remained really open, and at the same time, not believing the praise and not believing the naysayers, simply, writing every day without hope and without despair, just doing the work.
Could we also talk about how, in your case, you got your first book published? We always like on the show to kind of dive into the mechanics of agents and editors and things like that. So for you, how did it work?
I did everything wrong. So I had finished my novel. I had a professor whose girlfriend at the time was an editor at one of the publishing houses in New York. He asked me if he could show it to her. And she read it and she wanted to buy it. And she said, you should get an agent, which was very nice of her. She didn't have to do that. But she said, it'd be better for you to be represented. So I didn't know any agents. And again, the way things work now, there are panels of agents at all these schools, coming in and doing talks and having meetings with students, which, in my opinion, I've seen it, the students become so much more interested in that part of things than in actually producing a really good piece of work. So that wasn't the case at Sarah Lawrence when I was there. So I didn't know any agents. I didn't know anybody. A friend of mine saw a photograph in a magazine of two agents in New York, and she showed me the photograph, and she said, "This one looks like she's been in psychoanalysis. She will understand your work." So based on that very deep analysis of publishing and people, I called the agent. I just picked up the phone and I dialed, and her assistant answered, and because I had interest from a publisher already, she put the agent on the phone, and I stammered out something about what my book was about, and she said, "I'll take a look at it." And she called me the next day, and she asked me to come to the office, and she offered to represent me. That sounds like a fairy tale, but that agent was ultimately completely the wrong agent for me. She had never been in psychoanalysis. Um, her list, if I had done anything like study a list of authors, was almost all really heavy hitter male writers, almost no women at all, and certainly no brand new writers just starting out. And the thing about, and I say this to students and young writers all the time, is just do your homework, do some research, figure out, read the acknowledgments pages of books by authors you admire and see who represents them. There's so many ways of doing that research, and I didn't, and that relationship lasted 10 years, and those relationships are like marriages. So when I left her and moved on to another agent, it was not, that wasn't an easy thing to do, and but that's how I found my first agent, just a clipping from a magazine.
A good reminder that you can never tell whether someone's been in psychoanalysis from a photograph. Subsequent novels followed, but I wondered if we could talk now about your decision to then write Slow Motion, and the experience of writing about both yourself and your parents. I mean, did you kind of go about seeking your mother's approval for the manuscript? Did you find the whole thing uncomfortable at first? I mean, what were the decisions that you made that it was the right time to commit that story to paper?
I never thought I would write any memoirs. And after my first 3 novels, I was feeling like there was something that the fiction writer in me was being a little bit haunted by, that I needed a curative for. And that curative, it struck me, was attempting to tell the story that I wrote in my first novel as a story that hewed to memory, as opposed to a story that inclined itself in the direction of imagination. That first novel very much did sort of take off in its own imaginative directions. I felt like I wasn't done with that story, and it was haunting my fiction. In each of my novels, there was those early novels, there was some kind of sudden accident or event that took the main character by, sort of by storm, and I felt like I was being led around in a way by my story, and that I wasn't remotely in charge of it. So that's how it began. Then I got a book contract, and then I spent a year unable to write a word. I kept on sitting down to try to write it as if it were a novel, which is to say, to follow the line of words, to allow it to unfold. And one day I was taking a walk with a friend of mine who's a journalist, and I was really in despair. I was wondering if I was going to have to just cancel the contract. I didn't know what to do. And my friend said, "Have you outlined it?" And for novelists, at least for me, outlining was not something that I did, or the kind of writer that I was, and sort of was horrified by that, and said no. And she said, she just paused. We were taking a walk on the beach. I'll never forget it. And she said, "But you know what happened." And it was like this lightning bolt. I thought, oh, I do. I know what happened. So then what is the story? Because memoir is not sitting down in a room and writing down what you know happened. Why would anybody want to do that? It is a process of discovery. And so I went back home. I sat at my kitchen table, and I wrote this. I mean, it just was instinctive, but I made an arc, the arc was bisected by all these lines, and I thought, here is where it begins, with the moment that I received the call that my parents had been in this accident. Here's where it ends. I go back to school. A year happens in between. Here's where I fly home from California to see my parents in hospital. Here's where my father died. Here's where I finally end the relationship with, this terrible boyfriend. Here is where I begin to like sort of assume the responsibility of taking care of my mother. It laid out the overarching kind of story, but then underneath that arc that I had made was everything else, and the everything else I understood was the discovery. What associations, what belongs to what memories, what what is beneath this that explains some of it. And I did not ask my mother for her permission. It felt to me like, it's such a complicated thing and it's different with every book. I felt that what I was attempting to do was to tell my story. And in order to do that, I had to tell the story of what had happened in my family. And that felt like it was fair. It didn't feel to me. And, and one of the things I think a lot about as a memoirist is, where is the work coming from? If the work is coming from a place of score settling, or the work is coming from a place of revenge, then not only is that, raise all sorts of moral and ethical questions, but it also does not make for a good book. You can feel it. It just reeks of that. I was very aware that I would have been perfectly happy for my mother to never read this book. I didn't want to hurt her. I gave her a galley, so she saw it before it was published. And she had a few sort of factual things that she wanted to clear up. What was interesting to me was the things that I worried would upset her absolutely did not have any impact on her, at least at the time. And things that I could never have dreamt of bothering her did bother her. And that was a real lesson in, we don't know. We don't know how our work is going to, how it's going to land with people. But there's one other thing about that too, which is the writer Andre Dubus III is a good friend, and we've been on many panels together. And there was one time where someone really took him to task in the audience during the Q&A about having written about his brother in his memoir Townie. And his brother had been in a abusive relationship with a teacher in high school, and Andre was the older brother, and Andre wrote about it, and among other things in Townie. And Andre said, when I would come back from school to our house where there were no parents and no rules, and it was, just this kind of like just lawless place, and I would hear the sounds coming from the other side of my brother's room and his closed door. What happened to him on his side of the door is his story to tell. And how I felt, and my powerlessness, and my just shame, and my ineptitude, and my fear for him on my side of the door is my story to tell. And I've always really loved that, because it's a very visual image, with two sides of a door, and what right do we have to tell our stories, and the way that they impact or include others.
Hello listeners, you may remember that a few months ago we made some improvements to our Patreon offering, refreshing our package of successful pitches for people who support Always Take Notes. Since then, we've been so delighted to see more people join up. We've loved hearing from you about how useful you found the package and the podcast, but we're really keen to keep expanding the benefits available to all the people who support us.
So with that in mind, we've added 40 new pages of material to the package, including pitches to the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the BBC. This means the whole compendium now runs to a whopping 160 pages. And we're excited to announce that for people who contribute $10 a month, we're also going to start releasing bonus mini episodes. If you'd like to know what these will sound like, there's a sample episode with Lee Child that you can listen to for free on our Patreon now.
Thanks to the help of our sponsor, Scrivener, the first 10 new sign-ups at $10 per month will receive a lifelong license to Scrivener worth £55. This specialist word processing software helps you organise long writing projects, such as novels, academic papers, and even scripts. But we only have 10 to give out, so if you're interested, please check it out as soon as you can.
These are just a few of the updates we've made to our Patreon offering. So if you'd like to find out more about how to get your hands on an ATN mug, suggest questions for upcoming guests, or join a monthly call with us to workshop a pitch, head to www.patreon.com/alwaystakenotes. That's www.patreon.com/alwaystakenotes.
And thanks so much again for all your support so far. Just picking up on what you were saying about outlining, this is a kind of another perennial area that we always ask on the podcast, particularly with fiction writers, as to whether they plot or work out their plots in advance or just plunge in and follow their nose. And it sounds like for you, for fiction, you are not a plotter. Would that be? Have you always kind of just dived in?
It depends on the novel. I mean, I do just dive in, but I always have a couple of things that I can hang on to. It usually begins with character. Like if you have characters, you have pathos, and if you have pathos, you have drama. Ultimately, is the way I think of plot. And I'll often have a sense of something that's happened either between characters or to a character, and I won't know what it is, and I'll write toward that. I mean, in my most recent novel, Signifiers, when I started it, there was a tree in the middle of this property that everyone in the neighborhood had different feelings about. And I knew something had happened at that tree earlier, but I didn't know what yet. And that was a novel that I put aside for many years, and I wrote 100 pages and then I put it aside. I couldn't. And actually, to your question about plot, one of the reasons why I put it aside is because it was a novel that I had a very committed idea of a structure for that should have been pretty clear to me quickly wasn't going to work, was a totally flawed idea. But it was my structure and I was sticking to it. And that was that I was trying to tell the story backward in time. And I got about 100 pages in and I made the stunning realization that if you keep on moving backward in time, then at a certain point, your characters will not have been born yet. And if you want to tell their stories, that becomes problematic. And they'll never come back. If you keep on going backward in time, they'll never return to the narrative. So I put it in a drawer, and a lot of years went by, and I never thought I would return to it, but I was able to during the pandemic. I rediscovered it. And when I reread it, I understood how to write it. And enough years had gone by that something had really shifted for me, and I unlocked it for myself. But one of the very first things that I did was I realized I need to know what happened at that tree. And I wrote a prologue that came out of me like it had been waiting to come out of me for a dozen years.
It feels like a slightly more drawn out version of leaving your writing where you know where it's going to pick up and sleeping on it, and then you're able to write more easily the next day. In your case, it was 15 years, but
wouldn't recommend it.
Yeah. And in terms of writing memoirs, do you still stick to outlining in general as your method for those?
No. My memoirs, it's one of the very idiosyncratic aspects of my trajectory as a writer is that, so I wrote Slow Motion, which was a straightforward memoir that I did outline. And then I went back to fiction for my next two novels, Family History and Black and White. And then my next memoir was this book called Devotion it began to come out in these little pieces, like these, like sort of like a path of breadcrumbs. And as I started it, and it was clearly that's how it wanted to be written. I couldn't impose my will on it. And I thought, I may be writing a book that absolutely no one will read. What is this structure? I don't understand it. I don't know. I just stayed connected to it. And probably about halfway through, I understood why that had to be the structure. And then I began to really write into that. But it was the opposite of an outline. It was a tightrope. It was a high wire act. And then when I made a discovery when I was in my mid-50s and I had already written 2/3 memoirs. I mean, if you include still writing as a kind of memoir, I had written a couple of memoirs, 3, and I made the discovery that my dad had not been my biological father. And I realized that that was in large part the huge question mark that was quivering beneath all of that memoir writing I had been doing. I was actually digging for something that I didn't even know I was digging for. I was doing this kind of excavation because there was something that I didn't know, that I knew I didn't know, but I didn't know what it was, and it was huge. I had been feeling up until the time that I made that discovery, in a literary sense, I had started writing books that were mosaic in structure. They upended time. They played with time. There was white space. It was so much about the juxtaposition of scenes rather than one scene chronologically leading to the next. And I had begun to say, I've broken up with narrative. I'm done with narrative. I'm writing in this. It was very satisfying to me. I mean, my memoir Hourglass, very much a high wire act as I was writing it, but there was something incredibly satisfying about that to me. And then this story that was this narrative freight train of a story came crashing into my life, which was finding out that my parents had not told me the truth of my identity my whole life, finding out that, we began this conversation about secrets and secrecy, understanding finally why there was this sense that there were secrets everywhere in the house when I was growing up. I was the secret. And as a writer, I had begun to make secrecy and the corrosive power of secrets was my subject in many ways, or my theme. But, themes are just fancy words for what obsesses us. And we don't control what obsesses us. And I was obsessed by what I didn't yet know. And that led me to write, again, with Inheritance, a much more straightforward narrative. And in that case, I didn't outline it, but I had piles of index cards on the desk where I was composing it. And I came to realize that it was in 4 parts. And so I would make notes on index cards and think, this will go into part 4, or this will go into part 2. There was a kind of organizing principle to it, which hadn't been the case with my more kind of mosaic, kaleidoscopic memoirs.
Thanks very much for that detailed answer. On memoir more generally, it's sometimes suggested that female writers are steered by the publishing industry towards writing memoir in a way that men aren't. Do you think that's correct more generally? And have you experienced any element of that yourself?
I certainly didn't feel steered. I mean, unless what you mean by that was that, like, my inner compass was steering me. There was no part of me that ever wrote a memoir because I thought it was a good idea, or that it would be commercial or marketable. I mean, for better or for worse, I've never thought that way. I've always written just the next book that has, like, deeply and without question presented itself to me, even when I haven't wanted it. I think in terms of memoir, there's I think, real misunderstanding, both critically and maybe in the literary world in general. I was going to say readers, but I actually don't think it's true of readers. I think it's the literary world and its critics, and to some degree publishing, that there are these baskets, especially now, baskets that memoirs go into. I mean, like some of the language that I've been hearing in the last few years about this, student tells me they're writing a grief memoir. It's like, what is that? And this, I think, originated in the UK, but I first heard about it in the States. An agent saying to a writer who was writing a book about, the suicide of her sister, the death by suicide of her sister, I hope you're not writing a misery memoir. And I thought, misery memoir, is that redundant? I mean, is there any other, is there a joyful memoir? Is there a happy memoir? I mean, what makes, what is the engine for making, uh, not even making the choice, but having memory be the driving force in a certain kind of book. And I think critics, when they review memoir, often, very snobbily see memoir as a lesser art form. And I really reject that. When I teach, in the kinds of teaching that I do now, where I choose my students and I have my own pedagogy, and I don't have to follow I'm in an MFA program, so I'm teaching in the nonfiction track, or I'm teaching in the fiction track. I mix up the genres when I teach because it's all storytelling. And really, ultimately, and I think the fiction writers elevate the bar in a certain way for the memoirists, because there can be, in early memoir writing, a sense of, well, but it happened. I think it was Vivian Gornick who said, you don't get credit for living. This is not about like it happened and that's the defense of the story. How do you turn it into something that, touches the universal thread? And that's the job of the fiction writer, and that's the job of the memoirist as well.
Well, that leads on to what I wanted to ask about Inheritance, which was that critics described it often as a genetic detective story. And I wondered whether that was something that you were trying to achieve on the page, or whether it was something that just kind of happened organically.
I was trying to move it away from a genetic detective story. I mean, the genetic detective story took 36 hours. From the time that I discovered that my dad hadn't been my biological father until I was staring at a YouTube video of the man who was my biological father, who I never knew had existed. That was, I could have written an essay about that, but it wasn't a book. And that wasn't, and because, look, there are many people out there who make a discovery like mine and are never able to find their biological parent. So I feel extraordinarily lucky that I was able to, and that he was a kind and compassionate person. But to me, the engine of that book from the very beginning was, what did my mother know? What did my father know? What was that world? And I mean, I should say, for listeners who haven't read Inheritance, that my parents had fertility, trouble with fertility, a lot of trouble conceiving a child. And so they ended up using a sperm donor. And this was the early 1960s, where it was more common than you think, but it was a secret. It was absolutely a secret. Anyone who went that route was told to never tell the child, to never speak of it ever again, to never tell the grandparents, to pretend that it had never happened, right? So the more I learned, and I had boxes of research, the more I thought, what happened? Like how, and it was literally, the story of my life that I was writing about. The question of what right I had to tell this story never occurred to me, because without this story, which I would prefer to have not been my story, but was my story. I used to say to my husband, I don't want this story. I want to send this story back to the story store. I didn't get to send it back to the story store, and it was very much the huge missing piece of the puzzle of what had formed me, and some of the choices and the the incidents and experiences that had shaped my life. But so when I say that I put it into these piles of index cards, the first pile of index cards was maybe a third of that first pile had to do with the genetic detective story. The rest of it was, one of the things that I really had to think about when I started Inheritance was, and it's not a question I had ever asked myself before, and it's not necessarily a good question for a memoirist to ask, it depends, but I had to ask myself, what is universal about this story? Because everything else I had written about in memoir was something that a reader could relate to, even if they hadn't experienced it. The illness of a child, the death of a parent, misspent youth, all that, like everyone can kind of get on board that train if it's well done. This was, I found out in midlife that the dad who raised me, who was my beloved parent and who I modeled myself after in many ways, and who died too young, that he hadn't been my biological father, and that likely he had always known that, and that, that's, what do you do with that in terms of making it universal? And I found myself thinking, well, this is really at its core a story about identity and about nature versus nurture, and about what makes a family, and what makes a father, and, just what makes us us. And to me, that was infinitely more interesting. But I think, a lot of the genetic detective story is just the shorthand that is so often used to describe something that, sort of doesn't really do it justice.
We're coming up towards the end of our time, but another question that we ask everyone on the podcast is about money. So how that has interacted with their writing lives, and be as open or as guarded as you're comfortable with here. But we saw you mentioned elsewhere that you and your husband work 7 days a week, have no savings, no retirement plans, nothing to fall back on but each other. Is that still the case? And how has that element of your life worked, particularly with the teaching and with the screenwriting and other work that you do as well?
Oh, I'm happy to talk about that. And it's interesting because Hourglass is, just out. I guess it was in March in the UK, but it came out in the US in 2017. I wrote it in 2015, 2016. And I was interrogating some of those very questions of being two creative people without really a safety net, and the ups and downs of that. My life as a writer has, if it had a shape, it's continually been a story of becoming more successful. And I say that with no ego. It's just, that's what's happened. And I've worked very hard. But I think starting probably with the novels with Slow Motion, but then the novels after Slow Motion. And then Inheritance was a big bestseller, and, had all the movie stuff and all the foreign stuff and all the things you hope for. I was very aware of the great fortune of that because it wasn't my first book or my second book. It was my 10th book. And something I would add to that is that when I was on this tour for Inheritance, which I was on for really from the time it came out in 2019, straight up to the pandemic, when I was about to do a lot of international travel. I was about to go to Sydney. I was going to Paris for my book launch there. I was super excited about all those things. But that ended with the pandemic, which is just as well because I was exhausted. But at the same time as that was happening, my husband was very ill with cancer, and and he's fine today, and he survived. But it was this feeling that we had of like, no, you can't not do that. You have to do that because this is a once in a lifetime kind of thing that's happening right now. People are showing up all over the world for this story. It's striking a nerve. So I was both being the caregiver for my husband and packing my suitcase and going out on tour all at once. And then Signal Fires, my last novel, was also successful. And there have been, and I have a podcast. I guess this is one of the things. I was always willing to do anything as a writer. There's a scene in Hourglass where Michael, my husband, and I are writing a play for a pharmaceutical company. I mean, were we thrilled about doing that? No, we were not thrilled about doing that, but it kept the roof over our head, and it kept our kid in school. And, we started a writers' conference in Italy 19 years ago, and that is ongoing, and it's turned into this sort of magnificent thing that allows us to travel in Europe every year and get paid for it. So it's been this kind of, and then my husband also, the movies that weren't happening at the time that I wrote Hourglass have happened. So I am feeling right now very fortunate, but also I don't want to dismiss just how hard I've worked. I've had an appetite. No, I've not had an appetite for risk, but I have had a tolerance for risk. I've been able to tolerate not really knowing what was coming down the road. So now it's a little bit like this is a good moment of having a bit of a victory lap after not having had that kind of experience, but continuing to do the work, and also hoping that and working toward I really believe that each of my books has been better than the last. I feel like, I don't know what it would feel like to have a first book or a second book be the huge big hit book and then have everything else after it be kind of a pale echo and have people only want to talk to you about that early book. I mean, that would stink. So it feels to me, I feel like the shape has been a very fortunate one.
To that end, can you share what you're working on at present, or is it still taking shape?
No, I can. It surprised me again. I thought my next book would be a novel. It's actually a memoir. It's a little bit about what I just described, about how sort of the worst moment and the best moment can coexist and not cancel each other out. And it's about aging and fragility and 10 years on, kind of being in this place now. And it's structured very much as Hourglass was, in a kind of kaleidoscopic way.
Well, look, Dani, thank you so much for being a fascinating and very candid guest on the podcast. And we wish you all the best with your multiplicity of projects going forward.
Thank you. It's been great talking to you both.
That was the Always Take Notes interview with Dani Shapiro. She has a website, which is danishapiro.com. She's on Twitter at Dani J. Shapiro, and Signal Fires, her latest novel, is published by Chatto & Windus. Before we get started with the rest of the outro, we have a Patreon to thank. So Marcus is a student soon to be entering a legal career. He says he enjoys writing as often as he can on the side. He returned from Eastern Chad earlier this year to report on the Sudan Civil War, and he plans to travel to Mauritania soon to write a piece. Marcus, we wish you the very best of luck with all your writing, and thank you for supporting the show. Simon, what was your takeaway from the interview with Dani?
I thought the kind of complexities of writing about your own life, I think, were the thing that sat with me. I mean, she's clearly been very successful in that genre. I always find it interesting when we talk to people, both who've written autobiographical novels and straight memoir, how they have navigated these things, in particular with their own family. I thought she was quite thoughtful on that. I mean, I remember her talking a lot about this terrible man. You always sort of wonder, I mean, I've no reason to doubt that he was terrible, but you always sort of wonder what the reaction was from a personage like that when something comes out, and how those people have been navigated. And I think we had some quite interesting discussions with her about creative writing education as well, which is something that we've been kind of getting into on a number of recent episodes on the show. What about you, Rachel?
Yes, agreed, absolutely. We didn't really get into what it's like to be a kind of, I feel like serial memoirist is a bit of a strange phrase, but someone who writes about their life frequently. I mean, for instance, writing a memoir about your husband, current husband, as well as past ones. And I would also, we didn't really talk about it, but still writing is really enjoyable. And I think most of our listeners would enjoy her memoir of her writing life. And yes, just reminds me of the Nora Ephron phrase that everything is copy.
One of your favourite phrases, Rachel, in fact.
Of course. Simon, what have you been up to?
We're recording this on Easter Monday. I am slightly chagrined to say that I've had to work quite a lot over the Easter weekend. In terms of reading, I am reading a dense German language book called Lawinen, which is about avalanches. And then in TV, we tried, after our enjoyment of the Six Nations documentary, we tried watching the golf one, Full Swing, which I just couldn't really get into. I felt that, because your thing, I know, Rachel, is that it's not about the sport, but I think there is a bit where it is about the sport, and golf is just not.
I don't think golf is a sport, frankly. I think
it's a pastime.
Exactly. I think if you're walking at any point, it's not a sport.
I mean, Hyun, my partner's parents are enthusiastic / obsessional golfers, really, and so she was telling me, about all the terminology meant and everything like that. But I just think the visuals are not as compelling as in, a rugby match or an F1 race. So that has been abandoned. And actually, we have been watching The Hour, which is written by a Always Take Notes alumnus. And I've been enjoying it. I think you're conscious it's from 2012 and it's a sort of maybe slightly pre-screening era. And I'm thinking like, it would be nice to have a big shot of like a steam train, the way that like historical drama does, like.
You're hankering for that steam train.
I'm hankering for that like 100 million in production spent on this, which has not happened. And I do sometimes feel with this kind of show that you do see a difference between the kind of American, really ambitious writer's room, multi-plot strand thing, and a British tradition that comes a bit more out of linear TV and is kind of trying to like land a point on every line and stuff like that. But we're a couple of episodes in, so I reserve judgment. But it has a sort of pleasingly oleaginous and unpleasant Dominic West character who's quite good fun. Anyway, Rachel, what have you been up to and what have you been consuming?
I hope you get your steam train shot at some point. I have been also working over the Easter weekend. I'm still kind of getting my feet under the desk and used to the rhythm of the section, which obviously I've been working for many years, but it's slightly different when you're at the helm.
So, like,
yeah. And also it's been short weeks back to back, which is a bit of a killer. And then I was trying to write a piece in the middle of it, so it was not ideal actually. But then it's good. I'm really enjoying it. In terms of matters cultural, I have been reading a book called The Einstein Vendetta about Einstein's cousin in Italy and what happened to him and his family. In terms of television, I've been watching the second season of The Last of Us, and because they are adhering to an old school model of releasing episodes weekly, I've also been watching The Studio on Apple TV, which, given you what you just mentioned about ambitious Hollywood productions, it's a very funny counterpoint to that. In the pilot episode, this new studio head has to make a film about Kool-Aid because that is the IP that they have secured. And so it's about the tension between the creative and the commercial, which obviously is a long-standing theme of all artistic endeavours. So I would recommend it. It's got great cameos like Martin Scorsese in the first one. So yes, very fun.
That sounds really fun. Anyway, this has been Always Take Notes, hosted by me, Simon Acombe.
And me, Rachel Lloyd.
Our producer and social media editor is Artemis Irvin. Our score is by Jessica Danheiser, and our graphic design is by James Edgar.
If you'd like to follow us on social media, we're on Instagram at Always Take Notes. We're on Twitter at Take Notes Always. If you'd like to support us on our crowdfunding page on Patreon, we're on there under Always Take Notes. And if you'd like to leave a review on iTunes or get in touch with us via our website, please do.
Many thanks. Goodbye.